The helicopter's rotors roared against the prison yard wind. Officer Claire tightened her ponytail and smirked at the man in cuffs sitting beside her. "Fly this helicopter and I'll free you," she said, half joking, half cruel. The prisoner didn't answer. He just looked out the window, watching the guards fade into dots below. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue?" she mocked. Then he finally spoke, calm, steady, like someone used to giving orders, not taking them. "You're flying too low," he said quietly. "Wind shear's building over the ridge." Claire frowned. How could he know that? "What are you, some kind of pilot?" she scoffed. He looked at her, and that's when she saw it. The scar above his temple, the way his eyes scanned the instruments. Not curious, familiar. "I trained pilots like you once," he said softly, "before your department put me in here." And just as she turned toward him, the warning alarms began to scream. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will make you question who the real hero is in this story. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. Officer Claire Martinez had been flying police helicopters for 8 years. She'd earned her wings through grit, determination, and an unshakable belief that she belonged in the cockpit. Growing up in East Los Angeles, she'd watched police helicopters circle her neighborhood every night. While other kids complained about the noise, Claire would climb onto her apartment building's roof just to watch them dance across the sky. Her father, Miguel, had been a mechanic who worked on aircraft at the local airfield. He'd brought home stories about the machines he fixed, the pilots he met, the endless blue sky that stretched beyond their concrete world. When Claire was 12, he died in a workplace accident. A hydraulic lift failed while he was underneath a Cessna. She'd found his toolbox in the garage afterward, filled with aviation manuals he'd been studying in secret, dreaming of one day becoming a pilot himself. That toolbox became Claire's Bible. She memorized every page, every diagram, every specification. By 16, she could rebuild a rotary engine blindfolded. By 18, she'd earned her private pilot license with money from 3 part-time jobs. By 22, she was accepted into the police academy's aviation unit, one of only 2 women in her class. The other woman dropped out after the first month. The instructors made it clear they believed women didn't belong in the sky. Too emotional, they said. Not strong enough to handle the controls in emergency situations. Claire proved them wrong every single day, but the whispers followed her everywhere. She learned to build walls around herself, to never show weakness, to mock before being mocked. 8 years later, she'd become the department's most decorated helicopter pilot. 3 commendations for valor, 12 successful rescue operations, 0 accidents on her record. She'd earned respect through pure skill, but the chip on her shoulder had grown heavier with each passing year. Today's mission was supposed to be routine. Transport prisoner Marcus Webb from Riverside Correctional to the downtown courthouse for his sentencing hearing. Webb had been convicted of armed robbery and assault. The case file said he'd held up 3 convenience stores in 2 weeks, pistol whipping a clerk who tried to resist. Standard criminal, standard transport. Nothing she hadn't done 100 times before. What the file didn't mention was the way Marcus carried himself. Most prisoners shuffled when they walked, shoulders hunched, eyes down. Marcus moved like he owned the ground beneath his feet. When the guards brought him to the helipad, his posture was straight, his gaze steady. He looked at the helicopter the way Claire looked at classic cars, with recognition, appreciation, understanding. The guards shackled him into the passenger seat. Standard protocol for prisoner transport. Hands cuffed to a waist chain, ankles shackled, secured to the aircraft with a safety harness. Marcus didn't struggle or complain. He just settled into the seat and looked out the window. Claire ran through her pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision. Fuel levels, oil pressure, hydraulic systems, communications equipment. Everything checked out perfectly. The weather was clear, winds light and variable. A beautiful day for flying, if you weren't transporting a criminal to his sentencing. As she lifted off, Claire felt that familiar rush of power. The ground fell away beneath them, the prison walls shrinking to nothing. Up here, she was in control. Up here, she was free. She'd made that crack about freeing the prisoner as a joke. But the truth was, flying was the only thing that made her feel truly free. The route to downtown took them over the San Gabriel Mountains, then across the sprawling valley toward the courthouse. 32 minutes of flight time, according to her calculations. She'd done this route so many times, she could fly it with her eyes closed. That's when Marcus spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made Claire's skin prickle. Authority, experience, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd spent years making life and death decisions. "You're flying too low," he said. "Wind shear's building over the ridge." Claire's hands tightened on the controls. How could a convenience store robber know about wind patterns? How could he read the subtle signs that most pilots missed? The way the trees bent differently on the mountainside, the slight haze building over the peaks, the microscopic changes in the aircraft's behavior that telegraphed atmospheric disturbances. She glanced at the weather instruments. Everything showed normal conditions, but her gut told her Marcus was right. The helicopter was responding, just slightly differently than usual. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle shift in the way it handled the air currents. "What are you? Some kind of pilot?" she asked, trying to keep the uncertainty out of her voice. Marcus turned to look at her fully for the first time. That's when Claire saw the scar, a thin white line that ran from his left temple to his hairline. It was the kind of scar that came from flying glass or twisted metal. The kind of scar that told a story about survival, but it was his eyes that really got her attention. They weren't the eyes of a career criminal. They were scanning the instrument panel with the kind of familiarity that came from thousands of hours in the cockpit, reading the gauges, processing the information, calculating risks and responses with automatic precision. "I trained pilots like you once," he said softly, "before your department put me in here." The words hit Claire like a physical blow. Before she could process what he meant, the helicopter's warning systems erupted in a cacophony of alarms. The aircraft lurched violently to the left as a massive downdraft caught them in its grip. Claire fought the controls, her training kicking in automatically. But the mountain winds were stronger than anything in her experience. The altimeter spun downward. The artificial horizon tilted at an impossible angle. Outside the windows, the rocky mountainside rushed toward them with terrifying speed. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized they were in serious trouble. And sitting beside her, still shackled and cuffed, was a man who might be the only person who could save them both. Marcus watched Claire struggle with the controls, her knuckles white against the cyclic stick. The helicopter bucked and twisted like an angry horse, fighting every input she gave it. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the cool mountain air rushing through the vents. "Pull collective, ease off the cyclic," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the chaos of alarms. "You're over-controlling." Claire shot him a look of pure fury. "I don't need advice from a criminal." The aircraft dropped another 50 feet. Warning lights painted the cockpit in angry red. The ground proximity alarm joined the symphony of alerts, its urgent voice demanding immediate action. Claire yanked the controls harder, trying to muscle the helicopter back to level flight. "You're fighting the wind instead of working with it," Marcus continued, his tone maddeningly calm. "See that valley to your right? The air's cleaner there." "Shut up," Claire snapped, but her eyes darted toward the valley he'd indicated. He was right. The trees there showed less disturbance, the air currents more stable. Against every instinct screaming at her not to trust a convicted felon, she banked right. The helicopter responded immediately. The violent shaking subsided to a manageable vibration. The alarms fell silent one by one as they escaped the mountains, treacherous downdrafts. Claire's breathing slowly returned to normal, but her mind raced with questions she didn't want to ask. How did you know that? She demanded. Marcus shifted in his restraints, the chains rattling softly. 10 years flying medevac in Afghanistan. 2 tours as a flight instructor at Fort Rucker. You learn to read the air like a book, or you don't come home. Claire's world tilted on its axis. This man wasn't just some street criminal with lucky guesses. He was military, trained, experienced, possibly more qualified than she was. The realization made her stomach clench with something that felt suspiciously like shame. "If you're such a hotshot pilot, what are you doing in prison?" she asked, her voice smaller now, less certain. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains rolling past beneath them. When he spoke, his words carried a weight that seemed to press against the cockpit walls. 3 years ago, I was flying search and rescue for the county. Got a call about hikers trapped on Mount Baldy during a storm. My partner and I went up in conditions we probably shouldn't have attempted. He paused, his jaw tightening. We found them. Family of 4. Mother, father, 2 kids. The extraction went perfect. Everyone made it to the hospital alive. Claire waited, sensing there was more to the story. The helicopter hummed steadily around them. The crisis passed, but the tension thick as smoke. The father died anyway, Marcus continued. Internal injuries we couldn't see. Turned out he was Detective Ray Morrison, 20-year veteran, 3 kids, wife pregnant with their 4th. The name hit Claire like a sledgehammer. She knew that story. Every cop in the department knew it. Detective Morrison had been a legend, killed in what the newspapers called a helicopter crash during a rescue operation. But the official reports said the aircraft had gone down due to mechanical failure. "The crash," she whispered. "There was no crash," Marcus said bitterly. "We got them out clean." But Morrison's partner, Detective Valdez, he was looking for someone to blame. Needed a reason why his best friend died after a successful rescue. The department needed a scapegoat for the bad press. Claire's hands trembled on the controls. She remembered the news coverage, the questions about police aviation safety, the budget hearings that had nearly grounded the entire helicopter unit. Someone had taken the fall. Someone had been quietly arrested, tried, and convicted while the department moved on. They said I was negligent, that I flew recklessly, caused internal injuries during the extraction that led to Morrison's death. My own department testified against me, said I was a loose cannon, always pushing limits, putting civilians at risk. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Claire had wondered why there was no mention of military service in Marcus's file, why a man with his bearing and obvious skills had supposedly turned to armed robbery. The department had buried his history, rewritten his story, turned a decorated veteran into just another criminal. "The robberies," she said, "never happened." Marcus's voice was flat, empty. But when you need someone to disappear, when you need a clean narrative, it's easy to pin unsolved cases on the guy who's already going down. 3 convenience stores, all robbed by someone in a ski mask. No DNA evidence, no fingerprints, no witnesses who could identify faces. Perfect crimes to solve with a convenient suspect. Claire felt sick. She'd spent 8 years building her career in a department that had destroyed an innocent man to save face. Every commendation on her wall, every moment of respect she'd earned, suddenly felt tainted. "Why didn't you fight it?" she asked. "With what? My word against an entire police department? A grieving partner who genuinely believed I killed his friend? A widow and 3 kids who needed someone to blame?" Marcus shook his head. "Sometimes the system decides you're guilty, and fighting just makes it worse." They flew in silence for several minutes, the courthouse growing larger on the horizon. Claire's mind churned with implications she didn't want to face. How many other Marcus Webbs were sitting in cells, victims of a system that valued convenient narratives over inconvenient truths? "Today's your sentencing," she said finally. 25 to life. 3 strikes law. The robberies were felonies, and they dug up an old DUI from my college days to make it stick. Claire's throat constricted. A man who had spent his career saving lives was about to spend the rest of his life in prison for crimes he didn't commit, and she was the one delivering him to that fate. The radio crackled to life. Air 7, this is dispatch. What's your ETA to courthouse? Claire keyed the mic, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. Dispatch, Air 7. ETA 15 minutes. Copy that, Air 7. Judge is waiting. 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, Marcus Webb would walk into a courthouse and disappear forever into the state prison system. 15 minutes for Claire to decide what kind of cop she wanted to be, what kind of person. She looked at Marcus, still shackled beside her, staring out at the city sprawling below them. A man who had saved her life with knowledge earned through years of service. A man whose own department had thrown him away like garbage. Claire's father had always told her that the right thing and the easy thing were rarely the same thing. Looking at the courthouse ahead, at the radio in her hand, at the man beside her who deserved so much better than the fate awaiting him, she realized that her father had never been more right. The courthouse loomed ahead like a concrete monument to justice, but Claire saw it differently now. It looked more like a tomb. Her hands gripped the cyclic with white knuckles as she fought an internal battle that threatened to tear her apart. Marcus sensed her turmoil. He'd been watching her face change over the past few minutes, seeing the conflict play out in real time. The tough exterior she'd worn like armor was cracking, revealing something underneath that surprised him. Doubt, conscience, maybe even compassion. You don't have to do anything, he said quietly. I knew what I was walking into when I agreed to testify about what really happened that day on Mount Baldy. Some fights you lose before you start fighting. Claire's jaw tightened. You testified? Internal affairs investigation. Closed-door hearing. I told them exactly what happened during the rescue. How Morrison was injured before we even reached him. Crushed by falling rocks while trying to shelter his family. How the extraction was textbook perfect. How he thanked me for saving his kids even as the medics worked on him. The radio crackled again. Air 7, courthouse requests immediate landing. Judge wants to expedite proceedings. Claire stared at the microphone like it was a loaded weapon. Her finger hovered over the transmit button, but the words wouldn't come. Every protocol she'd learned, every regulation she'd followed, every chain of command she'd respected, suddenly felt like chains around her own wrists. My testimony disappeared from the official record, Marcus continued. Somehow the digital files got corrupted. The court stenographer's notes went missing. Funny how technology fails when it needs to work. Works perfectly when it needs to fail. Claire's mind raced back to her academy training. They'd taught her about the thin blue line, about loyalty, about protecting your brothers and sisters in uniform. But what happened when the uniform protected corruption instead of serving justice? What happened when loyalty became complicity? The courthouse helipad was visible now, a small concrete circle surrounded by official vehicles. She could see people waiting, bailiffs, court officers, maybe even reporters, all of them expecting her to deliver Marcus Webb to his fate, like a good little pilot who followed orders without question. There's something else you should know, Marcus said. His voice carried a new weight, something he'd been holding back. The night before Detective Morrison died, he called me. Personal call, not official business. He was scared. Claire's head snapped toward him. Scared of what? He'd been investigating something. Wouldn't tell me what, but he said he'd uncovered evidence of corruption in the department. Big corruption. Money changing hands. Evidence disappearing, cases being buried. He was planning to go to the FBI the Monday after our rescue mission. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Morrison hadn't just died from his injuries. He'd died before he could expose whatever he'd discovered. And Marcus, the only witness to Morrison's final words, had been systematically destroyed to ensure his silence. Did you tell Internal Affairs about the phone call? Marcus's laugh was bitter. First thing I mentioned, they said I was lying, trying to deflect blame by creating conspiracy theories. Said grief was making me paranoid. Detective Valdez himself testified that Morrison never mentioned any investigation. Claire's stomach churned. Valdez had been Morrison's partner for 8 years. If Morrison had been investigating corruption, Valdez would have been the first to know. Unless Valdez was part of what Morrison had discovered. The courthouse was less than 2 minutes away now. Claire could see the landing pad clearly, could make out individual faces in the waiting crowd. Her radio remained silent, but she knew dispatch would be calling again soon, wondering why she hadn't acknowledged their last transmission. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Marcus looked at her with those calm, steady eyes. "Because you have a choice to make, and I've learned that most people, when they really understand what's at stake, they make the right choice, even when it costs them everything." Claire's throat felt like sandpaper. "What choice?" "You can land at that courthouse and deliver me to a system that's already decided my fate. Go back to your life, your career, your comfortable certainties. Pretend this conversation never happened." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "Or you can ask yourself why a decorated combat pilot with no criminal history suddenly became a 3-time armed robber with perfect timing to disappear forever." The radio burst to life again. "Air 7, this is dispatch. You are ordered to respond immediately. What is your status?" Claire stared at the microphone. Her career hung in the balance. Her pension, her reputation, her future. Everything she'd built over 8 years of fighting for respect in a male-dominated field. One wrong move, and she'd lose it all. But a man who'd already sitting beside her was lost everything for telling the truth. A man who'd saved her life minutes earlier with knowledge earned through years of genuine service. A man who'd been that someone sacrificed to protect secrets, had killed to keep hidden. She thought about her father, working late nights studying those aviation manuals, dreaming of a better life he'd never lived to see. He'd taught her that the sky belonged to everyone who had the courage to reach for it, but he'd also taught her something more important. That courage wasn't about flying through storms or making perfect landings. Courage was about doing what's right, when everything inside you screamed to do what's easy. "Marcus," she said quietly, "if I don't land at that courthouse, if I turn this bird around right now, what happens to you? I become a fugitive. They'll hunt me down, probably kill me in the process, claim I tried to escape, attacked you, forced you to crash. My death will be just another tragedy in a system that's already forgotten I ever existed." Claire's hands trembled on the controls. "And what happens to me? You'll be investigated, suspended, probably prosecuted. They'll say I hijacked the aircraft, coerced you, threatened your life. You'll lose your badge, your pension, maybe spend time in prison yourself." Marcus's voice softened. "But you'll be able to look at yourself in the mirror. And sometimes that's the only freedom that really matters." The courthouse was 30 seconds away. Claire could see the judge's chambers through the tall windows, could imagine the courtroom where Marcus would hear his sentence. 25 to life for crimes he didn't commit, silenced forever by a system that valued convenience over truth. Her finger moved to the radio transmit button. She took a deep breath, thinking about Detective Morrison, about the investigation that died with him, about the corruption that continued to spread like cancer through the department she'd served faithfully for 8 years. "Dispatch. This is Air 7, she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "Air 7, go ahead." Claire looked at Marcus one more time. He wasn't pleading with his eyes or trying to manipulate her decision. He was simply waiting, prepared to accept whatever fate she chose for both of them. The man had already lost everything once. He'd found peace with the possibility of losing it all again. That's when Claire realized something that changed everything. This wasn't about saving Marcus Webb. This was about saving herself, about choosing what kind of person she wanted to be when the stakes were higher than personal comfort or career advancement. "Dispatch, we have a mechanical emergency. Oil pressure dropping rapidly. I'm diverting to the nearest safe landing zone for emergency maintenance." Silence filled the radio for several seconds. Then dispatch responded, their voice tight with suspicion. "Air 7, Our telemetry shows all systems normal. Please confirm your emergency status. Claire's heart hammered as she realized there was no going back now. Dispatch, I'm showing critical oil pressure loss. Initiating emergency procedures. Will advise when situation is stable. She banked the helicopter hard left, away from the courthouse, toward the mountain wilderness beyond the city limits. Below them, the concrete and steel gave way to forests and empty valleys where a helicopter could disappear for hours without being tracked. Marcus watched the courthouse shrink behind them, his expression unreadable. You know they'll never stop hunting us now. I know, Claire said, her voice stronger than she felt. But maybe it's time someone started hunting them back. The helicopter carved through the morning sky, carrying two fugitives toward an uncertain future. Behind them lay the ruins of their former lives. Ahead lay nothing but questions and the slim hope that somewhere in the wilderness, they might find answers worth dying for. Claire had always believed that freedom came from flying high above the world's problems. Now she understood that real freedom meant being willing to crash and burn for something bigger than yourself. The sky stretched endlessly before them, no longer an escape from the world below, but a battlefield where the war for truth had only just begun. The mountain wilderness stretched beneath them like an endless green carpet, broken only by rocky outcroppings and silver streams that caught the morning light. Claire had never flown this far from the city without a specific destination, without clearance, without backup. The silence from dispatch told her everything she needed to know. They weren't just concerned about a mechanical emergency anymore. They were mobilizing. How long before they scramble interceptors? She asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. Marcus checked his watch, a simple digital model that had somehow survived his 3 years in prison. 20 minutes, maybe less. They'll use the argument that I've hijacked the aircraft, taken a police officer hostage, gives them authorization to use lethal force. Claire's hands tightened on the controls. But the reality of what had made her choice, that meant, was settling in like cold water in her veins. In less than an hour, she'd gone from decorated officer to fugitive, from hero to criminal. The transformation felt surreal, like watching someone else's life implode in slow motion. There's a ranger station about 15 miles southeast, Marcus said, pointing toward a valley carved between two mountain peaks. Old fire lookout tower. Been abandoned since they switched to satellite monitoring. We could set down there, figure out our next move. How do you know about ranger stations? Claire asked, then immediately felt foolish. This man had flown search and rescue for years. He probably knew every landing zone in a 100-mile radius. Pulled a lost hiker out of that valley 2 years before my arrest, Marcus said quietly. Kid had fallen down a ravine, broken leg, hypothermia setting in. We barely got him out before dark. Claire banked toward the coordinates Marcus had indicated, dropping altitude to stay below radar coverage. The helicopter handled smoothly despite her frayed nerves, responding to her inputs with the mechanical precision she'd always found comforting. Up here, at least, the laws of physics still made sense. Actions had predictable consequences, unlike the legal system that had chewed up and spit out the man beside her. Can I ask you something? She said as they descended into the valley. In prison, did anyone else know what you were? What you'd been? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the trees rush past beneath them. First week inside, I kept my mouth shut. Figured it was safer that way. But there was this kid, maybe 19, in for dealing drugs to pay for his mother's cancer treatment. Real scared, getting pushed around by the hardened guys. Claire listened, adjusting their descent angle as the landing zone came into view. A small clearing next to a weathered wooden tower, barely large enough for the helicopter's rotor disc. One night, 3 inmates cornered him in the showers. I stepped in. Old habits, you know? Protect those who can't protect themselves. Marcus's voice carried a weight that spoke of violence avoided and consequences accepted. Word got around after that. The guards started watching me differently, not like a criminal, like something they couldn't quite categorize. The helicopter touched down with barely a whisper, Claire's training evident in the gentle contact with the forest floor. She powered down the engine, and suddenly the world was filled with mountain silence. No radio chatter, no city noise, no mechanical hum, just wind through pine trees and the distant cry of a hawk. They knew, Marcus continued as the rotor blades wound down. The guards, the warden, maybe even some of the other inmates, they knew I didn't belong there. But the system had spoken, and the system doesn't admit mistakes. Easier to pretend I was just another con who happened to have military bearing. Claire removed her headset and stepped out of the aircraft. The mountain air was thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and wildflowers. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine this was just a routine training flight, that she could climb back in and return to her normal life. The fantasy lasted exactly 3 seconds before reality crashed back down. "We need to remove your restraints," she said, pulling a key ring from her duty belt. "Can't have you running around in shackles if we're going to survive this." Marcus held out his hands without comment. The handcuffs came off with metallic clicks that seemed unnaturally loud in the forest quiet. He rubbed his wrists where the metal had chafed, then bent to unlock the ankle shackles himself. When he straightened, Claire was struck by how different he looked. Still the same man, but no longer diminished by the symbols of captivity. "Thank you," he said simply. Claire nodded, then turned to survey their surroundings. The ranger station was maybe 50 yards away, accessible by an overgrown trail that wound between massive pine trunks. The fire tower rose another 30 feet above the station, its windows dark and empty, perfect for spotting approaching aircraft or ground vehicles. "How much time do you think we have?" she asked. "Not much. They'll track the helicopter's GPS, send ground units up the access roads. Maybe 2 hours before this place is surrounded." Marcus walked to the aircraft and popped open an equipment compartment. "But we're not helpless. This bird carries survival gear, emergency supplies. We can disappear into these mountains for weeks if we have to." Claire watched him inventory their resources with practiced efficiency. Emergency medical kit, water purification tablets, high-energy rations, camping gear, everything a search and rescue helicopter would need for extended operations in wilderness areas. She'd checked these supplies herself during routine inspections, never imagining she might depend on them for her own survival. "There's something else we need to discuss," Marcus said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The corruption Detective Morrison was investigating. I didn't tell you everything." Claire's stomach clenched. "What else?" "Morrison left insurance, documents, recordings, evidence files. He gave them to someone he trusted, told them to go public if anything happened to him." Marcus met her eyes. That person was his partner's wife, Sarah Valdez. The name hit Claire like a physical blow. Detective Valdez had been one of the primary witnesses against Marcus, testifying about his supposed recklessness and disregard for safety protocols. But if Morrison had given evidence to Valdez's wife, if she knew the truth about what really happened, she never came forward, Claire said. "Sometimes the most dangerous criminals wear badges, and the most honorable people sit behind bars." Claire learned that truth 30,000 feet above the mountains when a prisoner saved her life and revealed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of her own department. Marcus Webb wasn't the criminal the system painted him to be. He was a decorated veteran, destroyed by corruption and betrayed by the badge he'd once served alongside. What started as a routine prisoner transport became a fight for justice itself. Two people, stripped of everything they'd built, choosing to risk their lives rather than let evil hide behind authority. The real question isn't whether they'll survive the manhunt that's surely coming. The real question is whether the truth Detective Morrison died protecting will finally see the light of day. Sometimes freedom isn't about escaping the cage. Sometimes it's about having the courage to break it open for everyone else trapped inside. And sometimes the only way to serve justice is to become an outlaw in the eyes of those who've forgotten what justice really means. What do you think? Did Claire make the right choice? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story opened your eyes to how broken systems can destroy innocent lives, Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines.